Dr. Sarah Chen had always believed that compassion was humanity's greatest strength, even when others called it their greatest weakness. As the chief medical officer aboard the exploration vessel Horizon's Edge, she had treated dozens of alien species with the same care she would give to any human patient. Her colleagues often joked that she would probably try to bandage a space rock if it looked hurt enough. The joke stopped being funny when they encountered the Zephyrian fleet. The first contact protocols had been followed perfectly. Captain Morrison had maintained a respectful distance, broadcast peaceful intentions in 17 different mathematical languages, and waited for a response. When it came, it was not what anyone expected. The Zephyrian ships were massive, each one easily 10 times the size of the Horizon's Edge. They moved with an organic fluidity that suggested biological rather than mechanical construction. Their hulls shimmered with colors that seemed to shift between dimensions, making human eyes water when observed for too long. "They're requesting permission to board," Lieutenant Rodriguez announced from the communication station, her voice tight with nervous energy. "Their message is unusual. They're asking specifically for our healing practitioner to attend to their prime reproductive." Captain Morrison frowned, his weathered face creasing into familiar worry lines. "Prime reproductive? That sounds like their queen," Sarah finished, already rising from her seat. "They want me to treat their queen." The captain turned to face her, his expression grave. "Sarah, we don't know anything about their physiology, their intentions, or their capabilities. This could be a trap." Sarah gathered her medical kit, checking the universal diagnostic tools that had been designed to work with most known biological systems. "Jim, they could have destroyed us already if they wanted to. Their weapon signatures are off the charts. If they wanted us dead, we'd already be space dust." "That's exactly what worries me," Morrison replied. "Why do they need our help? With technology that advanced, surely their medical capabilities far exceed ours." Dr. Martinez, the xenobiologist, looked up from his scanning equipment. "Captain, I'm reading massive biological signatures from their lead ship. Whatever these beings are, they're huge. The Queen could be anywhere from 20 to 50 meters in length, based on these readings." Sarah felt her pulse quicken. 50 meters? She had treated large alien species before, but nothing on that scale. Still, the fundamental principles of medicine remained the same regardless of size. Pain was pain, injury was injury, and suffering was suffering. "I'm going," she declared, slinging her expanded medical kit over her shoulder. "Send the acceptance signal." The transport that arrived to collect her was unlike anything in human experience. It appeared to be grown rather than built, with smooth, pearl-like surfaces that pulsed with internal light. When Sarah stepped aboard, she felt the deck beneath her feet adjust to her weight and gait, as if the ship itself was learning how to accommodate her. Her escort was a being of impossible beauty and alien grace. Standing nearly 3 meters tall, the Zephyrian moved on 6 legs that flowed like liquid mercury. Its torso was humanoid but elongated, covered in scales that shifted between gold and deep purple. Most striking were its eyes, 4 of them, arranged in a diamond pattern on its face, each one large enough that Sarah could see her own reflection clearly. "I am healer Vexthara," the being spoke, its voice resonating through specialized organs that produced harmonic overtones. "I guide medical practice among our kind. You are the human healer called Chensara?" "Just Sarah is fine," she replied, marveling at how the universal translator handled the musical quality of their language. "Can you tell me about the Queen's condition?" Vexthara's scales shifted to a darker purple, which Sarah's cultural briefing suggested indicated distress or concern. "Our prime reproductive, Queen Zixandrada, suffers from a condition we cannot comprehend. She experiences what your language might call sadness or despair, but these concepts do not exist in our biological framework." Sarah blinked in surprise. "Depression? You're dealing with psychological distress?" "We do not understand this concept. Zephyrians exist in a state of collective consciousness. Individual suffering is impossible within our neural network. Yet the Queen experiences isolation, pain that is not physical, and a reluctance to fulfill her reproductive duties that threatens our species' continuation. The implications hit Sarah like a physical blow. The Zephyrians were a hive mind species, but somehow their queen had developed individual consciousness, and with it, the capacity for loneliness and depression that came with true self-awareness. When did this begin? Sarah asked as they moved through corridors that pulsed with bioluminescent patterns. 7 cycles ago, after contact with the species you call humans, our fleet observed your vessel Meridian from a distance. The Queen was curious about beings who existed as separate consciousness units, yet cooperated effectively. She attempted to understand your nature by temporarily severing her connection to our collective mind. Sarah's heart sank. Human contact had inadvertently caused this condition, and she couldn't reconnect. She can reconnect, but chooses not to. She speaks of experiencing loneliness as both torture and revelation. She says the collective mind now feels like drowning, while individual thought feels like burning. She exists between states, belonging fully to neither. They arrived at a massive chamber that took Sarah's breath away. The space was easily 100 meters in diameter, with walls that curved upward into darkness. Bioluminescent patterns flowed across every surface like living constellations. At the center of the chamber, on a raised dais of what appeared to be living coral, lay the Queen. Queen Zixandra was magnificent and terrible to behold. Her body stretched nearly 40 meters in length, serpentine but with distinctly regal features. Her scales were larger than dinner plates, each one a masterpiece of natural art that shifted between colors Sarah had no names for. 6 powerful arms, each ending in delicate hands with too many fingers, lay folded across her torso. Her head was proportionally large, dominated by 8 eyes arranged in 2 rows, each eye easily as large as Sarah's entire head. But what struck Sarah most was the expression of profound sadness in those enormous eyes. "She is beautiful," Sarah whispered, and immediately felt foolish for the inadequate description. "Your arrival brings the Queen great curiosity," Vexthara explained. "She has requested to communicate with you directly, mind to mind, if you consent. This is an unprecedented honor. No alien consciousness has ever been permitted such contact." Sarah looked up at the massive being before her, seeing the intelligence and pain in those ancient eyes. Every instinct told her to proceed with caution, but her medical training demanded that she help a patient in distress. "I consent," she said simply. The moment Queen Zixandra's consciousness touched her mind, Sarah understood why the Queen could no longer tolerate the collective. The contact was gentle, careful, like the touch of a master surgeon. But behind it, Sarah sensed an intelligence vast beyond human comprehension. The Queen's thoughts were layered in dimensions Sarah's mind could barely grasp, full of concepts that had no human equivalent. "Small healer," the Queen's mental voice was warm but infinitely sad. "You carry within you the gift and curse I have discovered. Individual thought, the terrible beauty of existing alone in your own mind." Sarah found she could respond mentally, though her thoughts felt crude compared to the Queen's elegant communication. "Your Majesty, I'm here to help. Can you describe what you're experiencing?" "I remember existing as part of the greater whole, never questioning, never doubting, never feeling the weight of choice. Each thought was shared, each emotion distributed among millions of minds, until it became manageable. But then I touched the minds of your kind during observation, and I learned the exquisite agony of being truly alone with one's thoughts." Images flashed through the connection. The Queen's memories of her previous existence as part of the collective consciousness, where every decision was made by consensus of millions, where no individual ever bore the full weight of responsibility or doubt. Then came newer memories of the Queen attempting to understand human consciousness and accidentally severing her connection to the hive mind. "I can return to the collective," the Queen continued, "but doing so now feels like obliterating myself. I have become an individual, with thoughts and feelings that belong to me alone. To rejoin the hive would be to lose this new self I have discovered. Yet remaining alone is torture beyond description." Sarah felt tears streaming down her face as she experienced secondhand the Queen's impossible dilemma. The Queen had gained consciousness, true self-awareness, but at the cost of her connection to her entire species. "Show me," Sarah requested. "Show me how the collective mind feels to you now." The Queen hesitated, then carefully opened her consciousness to Sarah. For a brief moment, Sarah felt the presence of millions of other minds, all thinking in perfect harmony. It was overwhelming, beautiful and terrible and completely alien. Every thought was shared instantly, every emotion distributed and diluted until it became manageable. There was no loneliness, no doubt, no individual responsibility. But there was also no true self, no private thoughts, no personal growth. Then the Queen showed her the individual experience, the sharp clarity of thoughts that belonged to her alone, the weight of making decisions without consensus, the agony of loneliness, but also the exhilaration of true self-determination. "I understand," Sarah said softly. "You've gained something precious but lost something essential. You're caught between two states of being, unable to fully exist in either." "Yes," the Queen replied. "And my suffering affects my entire species. As prime reproductive, I must lay the foundation eggs for our next generation. But I cannot perform this function while trapped between states. My people face extinction because their queen has learned to think like a human." Sarah felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. She had come here to treat what she thought would be a physical ailment, but instead found herself facing a crisis that threatened an entire species. The Queen's condition was unprecedented. A hive-mind being who had gained individual consciousness but couldn't fully commit to either state of existence. "Your Majesty," Sarah began carefully, "in human medicine, we have learned that sometimes the most complex problems require the simplest solutions. You feel torn between two ways of being because you believe you must choose one or the other. But what if there was a third option?" The Queen's massive form shifted slightly, her scales rippling with colors that indicated intense interest. "Explain this third option, small healer. What if you could exist as an individual while maintaining connection to your people? Not as part of the collective consciousness, but as a bridge between individual and group awareness. Humans have leaders who make individual decisions for the good of the many. Perhaps you could become something new, a queen who thinks like an individual but acts for the collective." The chamber fell silent except for the gentle pulsing of the bioluminescent walls. Sarah could feel the Queen considering her words, her vast intelligence working through the implications. "You suggest I become something that has never existed," the Queen said finally, "a Zephyrian individual who chooses to serve the collective rather than being absorbed by it." "Yes," Sarah replied. "It would be frightening and lonely at times, but it would also be yours, your choice, your responsibility, your growth. And perhaps you could help others in your species who might want to experience individual thought while still belonging to the whole." The Queen's eyes brightened, literally glowing with increased bioluminescence. "You speak of evolution, small healer, of becoming something new rather than returning to something old." "I speak of healing," Sarah corrected gently. "Not by removing the new consciousness you've gained, but by finding a way to make it healthy, to make it serve both you and your people." For long moments the Queen remained silent, her consciousness turned inward as she considered this unprecedented possibility. When she finally responded, her mental voice carried a note of something Sarah recognized as hope. "Small healer, you have shown me a path I did not know existed. I would like to attempt this evolution you describe. But I will need guidance from one who understands both individual thought and service to others." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine as she realized what the Queen was asking. "Your Majesty, I'm honored by your trust, but I'm just a human doctor. I don't understand your biology, your society, your needs. You understand the heart of the matter," the Queen replied firmly. "You understand that healing sometimes means becoming something new rather than returning to something old. I request that you remain with us to help me learn to be both individual and queen, to help me forge a new path for my species." The request hit Sarah like a physical blow. The Queen was asking her to stay, to help guide the evolution of an entire species. It was an opportunity beyond anything she had ever imagined, but also a responsibility that terrified her. I need to discuss this with my crew," Sarah said finally. "This is not a decision I can make alone." "Of course," the Queen replied, her tone understanding. "You demonstrate the individual thought process I must learn. You consider consequences, consult with others, and take time to make important decisions. Already you teach me by example." As the mental connection gradually faded, Sarah found herself standing once again in the vast chamber, looking up at the alien queen who had somehow become her patient and now wanted her to become something like a teacher or counselor. "How do you feel, Your Majesty?" she asked aloud. The queen's response came through Vexthara, who served as translator. "The queen says she feels hopeful. She wishes to attempt the path you have suggested, but requests your guidance in this unprecedented journey." Sarah nodded slowly, her mind racing through the implications. She had come here to provide medical care and had instead become involved in what might be the most significant evolutionary step in Zephyrian history. "I need to return to my ship to discuss this with my captain and crew," Sarah said. "But please, tell Her Majesty that I am honored by her trust and will give her request the careful consideration it deserves." As Sarah was escorted back through the living corridors of the Zephyrian ship, she couldn't shake the feeling that this moment would change everything. Not just for the Queen, but for human-alien relations throughout the galaxy. She had intended to provide simple medical care, but instead had opened a door to something entirely unprecedented. The question now was whether she was brave enough to walk through it. The return journey to the horizon's edge felt like traveling between worlds, which Sarah supposed was exactly what she was doing. The Zephyrian transport moved with that same organic fluidity, but now Sarah was acutely aware that she was inside a living ship, surrounded by a consciousness that was both utterly alien and somehow familiar after her connection with the Queen. Captain Morrison was waiting in the docking bay when she arrived, his expression unreadable. "Dr. Chen, report."
Sarah took a deep breath, organizing her thoughts.
"Captain, the situation is far more complex than we anticipated. The Queen isn't suffering from a physical ailment. She's experiencing what we might call an existential crisis." The briefing room fell silent as Sarah explained everything. The Queen's accidental acquisition of individual consciousness, her inability to choose between collective and individual existence, and her unprecedented request for Sarah to remain as a guide. Dr. Martinez was the first to speak. "Sarah, you're talking about facilitating the evolution of an entire species. The ramifications of this are staggering. The political implications alone," added Commander Reeves, the ship's diplomatic officer, "could reshape interstellar relations. If the Zephyrians develop individual consciousness while maintaining their collective capabilities, they could become the most powerful species in known space." Captain Morrison leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled. "Sarah, I need to ask you directly, do you want to do this?" The question caught Sarah off guard with its simplicity. Did she want to do this? The rational part of her mind screamed that this was far beyond her qualifications, that she was just a doctor, not a xenopsychologist or evolutionary guide. But another part of her, the part that had driven her to become a doctor in the first place, recognized this as the ultimate medical challenge. "I think I have to," she said finally. "Jim, that Queen is suffering in ways I can barely comprehend. She's caught between two states of being, and that's causing psychological pain on a scale we can't measure. If I can help her find a way to resolve that conflict, you could help her become something entirely new," Dr. Martinez finished. "A true individual with the wisdom and knowledge of a hive mind. The implications are breathtaking." Over the next several hours, they worked out the logistics. Sarah would remain aboard the Zephyrian flagship as a medical consultant, with regular communications with the Horizon's Edge. The ship would remain in the system, studying Zephyrian technology and culture while Sarah worked with the Queen. As Sarah packed her extended medical kit and personal belongings, she found herself thinking about the Queen's words about the terrible beauty of individual thought. For the first time, she truly understood what that meant. The Queen had given up the comfort and security of shared consciousness for the lonely burden of thinking for herself. The transfer back to the Zephyrian ship felt different this time. Vexthara met her with what Sarah was learning to recognize as excitement, a rapid color shift in the being's scales that created an almost prismatic effect. "The Queen awaits you eagerly, healer Sarah," Vexthara said as they moved through the ship's corridors. "She has been, what is your word, practicing." "Yes, practicing individual thought processes." "Practicing how?" Sarah asked, curious despite her nervousness. "She has been making decisions without consulting the collective. Small decisions at first, choosing which chambers to inhabit, which nutrients to consume, which patterns to display on her scales. Each choice brings her both joy and terror. They arrived at the royal chamber to find it transformed. The walls now pulsed with new patterns, creating an almost musical light show. The queen herself was arranged differently on her dais. Her massive form curved in what Sarah somehow recognized as a more confident posture. When their minds connected, Sarah immediately sensed the change. The queen's consciousness felt more focused, more defined. The chaotic swirl of collective and individual thought had settled into something resembling harmony. Hila Sarah, the queen's mental voice carried notes of excitement and fear in equal measure. I have been practicing being myself. It is simultaneously the most frightening and exhilarating experience of my existence. Tell me about it, Sarah encouraged. What kinds of decisions have you been making? The queen shared her experiences, choosing to change the patterns on the chamber walls based on what pleased her personally rather than what the collective deemed appropriate. Selecting foods based on her own taste preferences rather than optimal nutrition. Even rearranging her position on the dais to be more comfortable rather than more imposing. Each choice feels like rebellion, the queen explained, but also like discovery. I am learning that I have preferences, desires, even fears that belong to me alone. That's exactly what individual consciousness feels like, Sarah confirmed. The freedom can be overwhelming at first, but it becomes natural with practice. I have also been observing my people, the queen continued, and I have made a disturbing discovery. Several members of my court have been experiencing echoes of individual thought. My transformation appears to be affecting others. Sarah felt a chill. Echoes? Can you show me? The queen's consciousness expanded, allowing Sarah to perceive other minds in the vicinity. Most felt like part of the collective, harmonious, unified, shared, but several stood out like discordant notes in a symphony. These minds carried traces of individual awareness, confusion, and what felt like longing. They're developing consciousness too, Sarah realized. Your transformation is somehow spreading. Yes, the queen confirmed, and they suffer as I suffered, caught between two states of being, unable to fully exist in either. My personal evolution has begun a chain reaction that threatens the stability of our entire society. The implications were staggering. If individual consciousness was spreading through the Zephyrian collective like a contagion, it could either represent the next step in their evolution or the complete collapse of their civilization. Your Majesty, Sarah said carefully, we need to understand how this is happening and find a way to help those who are affected. I have summoned 3 of my court who show the strongest signs of individual development, the queen replied. With your permission, I would like you to examine their minds and help me understand how to guide them. Sarah agreed, and soon found herself in the unprecedented position of conducting psychiatric evaluations on alien minds experiencing consciousness for the first time. The 3 courtiers, Vexthara among them, each displayed different aspects of emerging individuality. Vexthara had developed what humans would recognize as curiosity and a desire for learning. The healer was fascinated by individual consciousness and wanted to understand how it worked. The second, a military commander named Crixvow, had developed something like ambition, a desire to prove himself worthy of individual recognition rather than simply serving the collective good. The third, a younger Zephyrian called Nemira, who served as the queen's personal attendant, had developed what could only be described as artistic sensibilities. She wanted to create patterns and arrangements that pleased her personally rather than serving purely functional purposes. Each was struggling with the same fundamental conflict that had paralyzed the queen, the inability to choose between collective harmony and individual expression. I think I understand what's happening, Sarah finally said after examining all 3 minds. Individual consciousness isn't just spreading randomly. It's developing along the lines of each being's natural talents and inclinations. Vexthara's curiosity, Crixvo's leadership potential, Nemira's creativity. These were always part of who they were, but the collective consciousness suppressed individual expression of these traits. You believe this is evolution rather than disease, the queen observed. I think it might be both, Sarah replied honestly. Evolution often begins as what appears to be a disorder or mutation. The question is whether your species can adapt to accommodate both collective and individual consciousness, or whether one will destroy the other. Over the following days, Sarah worked with the Queen and the affected courtiers to develop what she thought of as consciousness exercises, structured ways to practice individual thought while maintaining connection to the collective. The breakthrough came when Nimira made an observation that surprised everyone. "I can choose when to think individually and when to rejoin the collective," she explained through the translation system. "It is not a permanent separation. I can step into my own mind to create or decide, then step back into the shared consciousness to contribute my individual insights to the whole." This revelation changed everything. The affected Zephyrians weren't losing the ability to connect to the collective. They were gaining the ability to choose when to be individual and when to be part of the whole. With Sarah's guidance, they began developing protocols for what she called conscious transitioning, deliberate movement between individual and collective states of mind. The Queen became adept at spending time in individual consciousness to make personal decisions and creative choices, then reconnecting to the collective to share her insights and lead her people. "It is like learning to speak a new language," the Queen explained during one of their sessions. "At first, the words feel foreign and difficult, but with practice, it becomes natural to choose which language suits the moment." The transformation wasn't without challenges. Some members of the collective resisted the changes, fearing that individual consciousness would lead to division and conflict. Others embraced it too enthusiastically and risked losing their connection to the group entirely. Sarah found herself developing training protocols that helped new individuals maintain balance between states of consciousness. She taught them meditation techniques adapted from human practices, ways to strengthen individual identity without completely severing collective bonds. But the real test came when the Queen announced her intention to resume her reproductive duties, not as a creature driven by collective instinct, but as an individual choosing to serve her species' future. The ceremony was unlike anything in Zephyrian history. Instead of the traditional collective ritual where the entire population participated mentally, the Queen chose to approach reproduction as an individual decision made for collective benefit. She selected her genetic partners based on personal compatibility as well as biological optimization. She chose the timing based on her own readiness rather than collective schedules. The result was revolutionary. The eggs she laid carried genetic markers that suggested their offspring would be naturally capable of conscious transitioning between individual and collective awareness. The Zephyrian species was evolving, guided by human compassion and alien wisdom. "Healer Sarah," the Queen said during one of their final sessions, "you have taught me that healing is not always about returning to what was. Sometimes it is about embracing what could be." "You taught yourself," Sarah replied. "I just helped you see that individual thought doesn't have to mean abandonment of your people. You've become something new, an individual who chooses to be part of something greater." As Sarah prepared to return to the horizon's edge after weeks with the Zephyrians, she reflected on how much had changed. The Queen was no longer the suffering being she had first encountered, but a confident individual who had found a way to honor both her personal consciousness and her collective responsibilities. The three courtiers had become teachers themselves, helping other Zephyrians who were developing individual awareness. A new class was emerging within Zephyrian society, beings who could think as individuals while remaining connected to the collective consciousness. But perhaps most importantly, the species had gained something unprecedented: the ability to choose. Each Zephyrian would now develop the capacity to move between individual and collective states, to contribute personal insights to group decisions, to grow as individuals while remaining part of a greater whole. "Your species will never be the same," Sarah observed as she prepared to leave. "No," the Queen agreed, "and that is the most beautiful gift you could have given us. We will become something new, something that has never existed before. Individual minds choosing to work in harmony rather than being forced into it." As Sarah's transport prepared to depart, she received one final mental message from the Queen. "Healer Sarah, you came to treat what you thought was a disease and instead helped birth an evolution. Your species' capacity for compassion and individual growth has given mine a new future. We will not forget this gift." Standing in the docking bay of the horizon's edge, Watching the magnificent Zephyrian ships prepare to continue their journey, Sarah realized that she had witnessed something unprecedented in galactic history. Not just first contact, but first evolution. The birth of a new kind of consciousness that bridged individual and collective awareness. Dr. Martinez met her as she disembarked. How do you feel about changing the course of evolution for an entire species? Sarah smiled, thinking of the Queen's words about the terrible beauty of individual thought. I think I understand now why humans are so dangerous to the rest of the galaxy. We don't just treat symptoms, we inspire transformations. We make other species want to become more than they were. And that's a good thing? Sarah looked back at the Zephyrian ships, their hulls now displaying new patterns that reflected individual artistic choices rather than pure functionality. Ask me in 100 years when we see what the Zephyrians become. But right now, I think we just made the galaxy a more interesting place. 6 months after the first encounter with Queen Zixandra, the Horizon's Edge received an urgent communication from Galactic Central Command. Dr. Sealdebro, Sarah Chen found herself summoned to a classified briefing that would change everything she thought she knew about the consequences of her actions. Admiral Reginald Hayes, a stern man with silver hair and calculating eyes, presided over the holographic conference. Representatives from 12 different species appeared as shimmering projections around the briefing table, their expressions ranging from curious to openly hostile. Chen, Admiral Hayes began without preamble. Your intervention with the Zephyrian species has created what intelligence analysts are calling the most significant political upheaval in galactic history. We need to discuss the consequences of your medical treatment. Sarah felt her stomach drop. Sir, I provided medical assistance to a suffering patient. I followed standard protocols for... You taught a hive mind species to think as individuals, interrupted Ambassador Vorthak, a crystalline being whose species had been part of the Galactic Council for over 1,000 years. The ramifications are spreading throughout known space. Admiral Hayes activated a holographic display showing a three-dimensional map of local galactic space. Red indicators pulsed across dozens of star systems. In the 6 months since your encounter with Queen Zixandra, we've received reports of similar consciousness developments in 17 different hive mind species. They're calling it the Chen effect. The term hit Sarah like a physical blow. They had named this unprecedented evolution after her, as if she had deliberately set out to transform galactic civilization. The Zephyrians have been sharing their new consciousness techniques with other species, continued Dr. Yexlani, an sectoid representative whose compound eyes reflected the holographic display in prismatic patterns. Your conscious transitioning protocols have become the most sought-after information in the galaxy. Sarah stared at the display, counting the affected systems. 17 species? How is that possible? I only worked with the Zephyrians. The queen you treated has become something of a revolutionary, Admiral Hayes explained, his tone carrying notes of both admiration and concern. She's been traveling from system to system, teaching other hive mind species how to develop individual consciousness while maintaining collective bonds. She calls herself a consciousness missionary. Ambassador Kriltex, representing a species of energy beings pulsed with agitated colors. The traditional order of galactic civilization depended on the stability of hive mind species. Individual consciousness makes them unpredictable, potentially dangerous, or potentially revolutionary in the best sense, countered Representative Plexara, a mammalian species known for their diplomatic skills. Initial reports suggest that species developing dual consciousness are becoming more innovative, more adaptable, more capable of complex problem-solving. The debate that followed revealed the true scope of what Sarah had inadvertently triggered. The galaxy's political structure had been built on the assumption that certain species operated as predictable collective entities. Hive minds served as stable points in interstellar politics, their decisions made through consensus and their actions guided by group survival instincts. Now those assumptions were crumbling. Show her the Valdorian situation, Admiral Hayes commanded. The display shifted to show a star system at the galaxy's edge. The Valdorians had been a peaceful hive mind species for millennia, serving as mediators in territorial disputes because of their collective wisdom and inability to favor individual interests. 3 weeks ago, a group of Valdorian individuals attempted what they called a consciousness revolution, Dr. Yexlani reported. They tried to force individual awareness on their entire population simultaneously. The result was catastrophic. Sarah watched in horror as the display showed the aftermath. A civilization in chaos, with some members trapped in permanent individual consciousness, others locked in collective paralysis, and many caught in a tormented state between the two. 17 Valdorian colonies are now essentially non-functional, Admiral Hayes said grimly. They're requesting immediate assistance from human consciousness specialists. Specifically, they're asking for you. The weight of responsibility crashed down on Sarah like a physical force. Her intervention with Queen Zixgandra had been successful because it was careful, gradual, guided by the Queen's own pace and desires. But other species were attempting to replicate the process without understanding the delicate balance required. There's more, Ambassador Vorthak announced, her crystalline form resonating with ominous harmonics. Intelligence reports suggest that the hegemony is planning to exploit this instability. The hegemony was a militaristic alliance of species that had been seeking to expand their territory for centuries. They were held in check primarily by the defensive alliances of hive mind species, whose collective decision-making made them formidable opponents. If hive mind species become destabilized or distracted by consciousness transitions, the hegemony sees an opportunity for territorial expansion, Admiral Hayes explained. Our analysts believe they're already mobilizing fleets toward vulnerable systems. Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. You're saying my medical treatment might have destabilized galactic peace? Not intentionally, Representative Plexara said gently. But the galaxy is changing, Dr. Sachen, and change always brings both opportunities and dangers. Admiral Hayes leaned forward. The Council has decided that you need to be directly involved in managing this crisis. You understand the consciousness transition process better than anyone else. We're forming a special task force to assist affected species and prevent the situation from spiraling out of control. What exactly are you asking me to do? Sarah asked, though she suspected she already knew. We're asking you to become the galaxy's first consciousness specialist, Admiral Hayes replied. To help species navigate the transition safely, to prevent disasters like the Valdorian situation, and to ensure that the Chen effect becomes a force for positive evolution rather than galactic destabilization. The next few hours were a whirlwind of briefings, planning sessions, and resource allocations. Sarah found herself at the center of an unprecedented galactic mission, helping entire species learn to think as individuals while maintaining their collective bonds. Her team would include xenopsychologists, communication specialists, military advisors, and medical personnel from a dozen different species. They would travel in a specially designed vessel capable of supporting multiple life support systems and equipped with the most advanced communication and medical technology available. But first, they had to deal with the immediate crisis of the Valdorian collapse. The journey to the Valdorian system took 3 days, during which Sarah studied every available report on their situation. The Valdorians were an aquatic species that had evolved collective consciousness as a survival mechanism in their ocean homeworld. Unlike the Zephyrians, who could physically separate from each other while maintaining mental contact, Valdorian consciousness was tied to physical proximity within their underwater cities. When a group of Valdorian progressives had attempted to force individual consciousness on their entire population, they had essentially shattered a mental network that had existed for millions of years. The result was cognitive chaos on an unprecedented scale. Yexlani, who had joined Sarah's team as xenopsychology specialist, provided additional context during the journey. The Valdorians attempted to implement your consciousness transitioning protocols all at once, across their entire population. They didn't understand that the process requires careful individual preparation and gradual implementation. It's like trying to perform surgery on an entire city at once, Sarah replied grimly. No wonder it failed catastrophically. When they arrived at the Valdorian homeworld, the scope of the disaster became immediately apparent. The planet's ocean cities, normally bustling with coordinated activity, showed signs of chaos and abandonment. Some areas pulsed with the erratic bioluminescence of mines in distress, while others had gone completely dark. The Valdorian representative who met them was a being named Fluxandra, one of the few who had managed to achieve stable individual consciousness before the crisis began. Her appearance was striking, a translucent, jellyfish-like form that moved through the water with graceful, deliberate motions that marked her as an individual rather than part of a collective. Consciousness specialist Chen. She spoke through a translation device that converted her bioelectric communications into audible speech. Our people suffer from a wound we inflicted upon ourselves. We sought to become like the Zephyrians, to gain the gift of individual thought, but we were impatient. The tour of the affected cities was heartbreaking. Sarah witnessed Valdorians trapped in various states of consciousness dysfunction, some locked in permanent individual awareness and unable to reconnect with others stuck in fragments of collective consciousness that no longer functioned properly, and many caught in a nightmarish middle state where they experienced chaotic fragments of other minds without the ability to process or escape the mental noise. How many are affected? Sarah asked, as they moved through the eerily quiet corridors of what had once been a thriving collective city. Approximately 40% of our population, Fluxandra replied. The rest retreated deeper into collective consciousness as a defense mechanism, but they remained terrified to attempt any form of individual thought. Sarah examined several of the affected individuals using techniques she had developed during her work with the Zephyrians. The problem was immediately apparent. The Valdorians had tried to force a transition that needed to happen gradually and voluntarily. Their minds had been overwhelmed by the sudden influx of individual consciousness without the preparation needed to handle it. We need to approach this systematically, Sarah announced to her team. First, we stabilize those who are trapped in dysfunctional states. Then we work with the collective remnants to help them understand that individual consciousness is a choice, not an obligation. The treatment process was complex and exhausting. Sarah worked with each affected individual to help them find a stable state of consciousness. Sometimes that meant helping them return to collective awareness. Sometimes it meant teaching them to manage individual thought. And often it meant finding a balance between the two. Dr. Sobe, Yexlani proved invaluable in developing rapid assessment techniques for determining each patient's optimal consciousness state. Not every individual is suited for individual consciousness, she observed after examining dozens of cases. Some minds are fundamentally designed for collective operation. The key is giving them the choice rather than forcing a particular state. The breakthrough came when Sarah realized that the Valdorians needed to rebuild their collective consciousness infrastructure before anyone could safely transition to individual awareness. The forced transition had damaged the mental networks that allowed them to reconnect to the collective, leaving even those who wanted to return to group consciousness unable to do so properly. Working with Fluxandra and other stable individuals, Sarah developed a protocol for rebuilding collective consciousness networks on a smaller scale. Instead of trying to recreate the planet-wide hive mind that had existed before, they established local collective networks that could support dozens or hundreds of individuals. Think of it as creating neighborhoods of consciousness, Sarah explained to the Valdorian Council of Stable Individuals. Small enough to be manageable, large enough to provide the collective support your species needs, but flexible enough to allow individuals to move between collective and individual awareness as desired. The healing process took weeks, but gradually the Valdorian cities began to show signs of renewed life. The new consciousness infrastructure allowed individuals to choose their level of collective involvement while providing support for those who needed it. Most importantly, it provided a model that could be shared with other species facing similar transitions. As Sarah prepared to leave the Valdorian system, Fluxandra offered a perspective that would stay with her for the rest of her mission. Consciousness specialist Chen, you have taught us that evolution is not about abandoning what we were, but about choosing what we will become. The crisis we created was born from trying to change too quickly, without respect for our nature. You have shown us that true growth honors both our past and our potential future. The success with the Valdorians established Sarah as the galaxy's premier consciousness specialist, but it also revealed the scope of the challenge ahead. 17 species were undergoing various forms of consciousness evolution, each with unique physiologies, cultural backgrounds, and needs. Some, like the crystalline Nexari, were developing individual consciousness as a natural extension of their existing mental capabilities. Others, like the gas giant dwelling Aryans, were struggling with the concept of individual identity, when their very existence was tied to collective atmospheric patterns. Each species required a different approach, different techniques, different timelines for safe transition. Sarah found herself at the center of the most complex medical and psychological challenge in galactic history. But as reports came in from successfully transitioned species, a pattern emerged that gave her hope. Species that achieved stable dual consciousness, the ability to choose between individual and collective states, showed remarkable improvements in creativity, problem-solving ability, and adaptability. The Zephyrians, under Queen Zixandra's leadership, had become one of the most innovative civilizations in known space. Their technology was advancing rapidly as individual creativity combined with collective knowledge. Other successfully transitioned species showed similar developments. "You're not just helping species evolve," Dr. Bang Yexlani observed as they traveled between assignments. "You're helping to create a new type of civilization, one that combines the best aspects of individual creativity and collective wisdom." Sarah watched the stars passing outside their ship's viewport, thinking about the weight of responsibility she carried. The Chen effect was reshaping galactic civilization in ways no one could have predicted. The question now was whether she could guide that transformation toward positive outcomes. The answer would determine the future of countless species, and perhaps the galaxy itself. 2 years after the Valdorian crisis, Dr. Sarah Chen stood in the observation deck of the starship Harmony, watching the most unprecedented gathering in galactic history unfold before her. Representatives from 43 species floated, swam, crawled, and flew through the massive assembly chamber built specifically for this occasion, the first Galactic Consciousness Summit. The chamber itself was a marvel of cooperative engineering, capable of supporting dozens of different atmospheric requirements simultaneously. Aquatic species swam through enclosed water channels that intersected with atmospheric zones for air-breathing beings. Crystalline entities communicated through harmonic resonances that translated into comprehensible frequencies for organic minds. At the center of it all, Queen Zixandra held court, like a living bridge between worlds. Her massive form had been modified with biomechanical enhancements that allowed her to communicate directly with species whose consciousness operated on completely different principles than her own. "The transformation continues to accelerate," reported Dr. Fishery Yexlani, approaching Sarah with a datapad displaying the latest consciousness evolution statistics. "We're now seeing spontaneous individual development in species that have had no direct contact with Chen effect carriers." Sarah studied the data with a mixture of pride and concern. In the 2 years since the Valdorian crisis, her team had successfully guided 18 species through consciousness transitions, but the effect was spreading beyond their direct intervention, almost as if the galaxy itself was evolving toward a new state of awareness. "How is that possible?" Sarah asked. "Consciousness development requires direct guidance and careful preparation," Yexlani replied. "But it appears that species observing successful transitions are somehow developing the neurological pathways necessary for dual consciousness on their own. It's unprecedented evolutionary adaptation happening in real time." The implications were staggering. Evolution typically occurred over millions of years, but the Chen effect seemed to be triggering rapid consciousness development across multiple species simultaneously. Sarah found herself wondering if they were witnessing the birth of a new type of galactic civilization. Admiral Hayes materialized as a hologram beside them, his expression grave. "Dr. Chen, we have a problem. The hegemony has made their move." The main display shifted to show a tactical overview of the Rigel sector. Red markers indicated hegemony military vessels advancing towards systems occupied by species undergoing consciousness transitions. "They're targeting the most vulnerable populations," Admiral Hayes continued. "Species caught in the middle of consciousness evolution, when they're least able to mount coordinated defenses." Sarah felt her blood run cold. The hegemony had waited for the perfect moment, when traditional hive mind defenses were compromised by ongoing consciousness transitions, but before the affected species had fully developed the benefits of dual consciousness. "How many systems?" she asked. 12 so far, with indications they're planning to hit at least 6 more. The attack pattern suggests they're trying to capture consciousness transition technology rather than simply conquering territory. The horrible logic became clear. The hegemony wanted to weaponize consciousness evolution, to force their enemies into unstable transition states while developing controlled consciousness enhancement for their own species. Queen Zix-Andra's massive form shifted as she received the same intelligence briefing through quantum communication links. When she spoke, her words carried the weight of both individual determination and collective wisdom. "This cannot be permitted," she announced, her voice resonating through every communication system in the chamber. The gift of consciousness choice must not become a weapon of oppression. The response was immediate and unprecedented. Species that had never cooperated before began forming defensive alliances. Individual capable beings offered their enhanced creativity for military planning, while collective consciousness networks provided the coordination necessary for large-scale defensive operations. But Sarah realized something that chilled her to the bone. "They're not just targeting vulnerable species," she said suddenly. "They're targeting the consciousness specialists. They want to capture the people who understand the transition process." Admiral Hayes nodded grimly. "Intelligence suggests they've already attempted to kidnap 2 of your team members who are working in the outer systems. We're implementing emergency security protocols for all consciousness specialists." The summit transformed from a celebration of evolutionary progress into a war council. Sarah found herself at the center of military planning sessions, her medical expertise now crucial for understanding how consciousness transitions could be weaponized or defended against. Dr. Yexlani presented a disturbing analysis. If the hegemony captures consciousness specialists and forces rapid transitions on captive populations, they could create armies of beings trapped in unstable consciousness states. Essentially, consciousness slaves who can't think clearly enough to resist, but retain enough individual awareness to be creative problem solvers. The concept was horrifying. Sarah's work to free beings from consciousness suffering could be twisted into a tool for creating the ultimate form of mental slavery. "We need to accelerate the defensive transitions," Sarah decided. "Every species currently undergoing consciousness evolution needs to reach stability before the hegemony can exploit their vulnerability." What followed was the most intensive consciousness specialist deployment in history. Sarah's team now expanded to include specialists from successfully transitioned species spread across the galaxy in a desperate race against hegemony expansion. Sarah herself took on the most dangerous assignment, the Nexus system, where 3 different species were simultaneously undergoing consciousness transitions. Intelligence indicated it was the hegemony's primary target, both for its strategic location and the unprecedented opportunity to study multiple transition types simultaneously. The journey to the Nexus system revealed the scope of the crisis. Space traffic showed clear signs of military mobilization as species throughout the galaxy prepared for either defense or conquest. Some systems had gone into complete lockdown, while others buzzed with the activity of hastily formed alliances. When Sarah arrived at Nexus, she found a situation more complex than anyone had anticipated. The 3 species, the crystalline Nexari, the energy-based luminals, and the mechanical constructors, had not only developed individual consciousness, but had begun experimenting with cross-species consciousness sharing. "They're creating hybrid consciousness networks," reported Dr. Ketharos, a Nexari consciousness specialist who had joined Sarah's team. "Beings from different species are learning to share awareness temporarily, creating unprecedented collaborative capabilities." Sarah examined the phenomenon with amazement. Crystalline beings were temporarily sharing consciousness with energy entities, while mechanical constructs interfaced directly with organic minds. The result was problem-solving capabilities that exceeded anything seen before in galactic history. "This is beyond dual consciousness," Sarah realized. "They're developing multi-species collective awareness while maintaining individual identity. It's evolutionary leap beyond anything we've seen." But the discovery came with terrible timing. Hegemony forces arrived in the system just as Sarah was documenting the breakthrough. The battle that followed would be remembered as the turning point in galactic consciousness evolution. The Nexus species, working with hybrid consciousness networks, demonstrated capabilities that shocked both sides of the conflict. Nexari crystal mines provided perfect mathematical modeling of hegemony attack patterns. Luminal energy beings interfaced directly with ship systems to enhance defensive capabilities. Constructor machines rapidly adapted alien technology to create new weapons and shields. But most importantly, individuals from all three species shared their consciousness temporarily with beings throughout the galaxy, spreading the hybrid consciousness techniques in real time. Sarah found herself at the center of the most complex consciousness network ever created, temporarily linked to thousands of minds across dozens of species. Through this network, she could coordinate consciousness transitions on a galactic scale, helping vulnerable species achieve stability even in the middle of the battle. The hegemony forces, faced with an enemy that could adapt and evolve in real time, found their advantage rapidly diminishing. Their weapons and tactics, designed to exploit the predictable responses of traditional hive minds or the chaotic vulnerability of unstable transitions, proved useless against beings who could shift between multiple consciousness states at will. More critically, exposure to hybrid consciousness networks began affecting hegemony personnel. Sarah watched through shared awareness as enemy soldiers experienced brief moments of expanded consciousness, glimpses of what they could become if they abandoned their militaristic culture. The war ended not with a decisive battle, but with a transformation. Hegemony forces, exposed to consciousness expansion possibilities, began defecting en masse. Their rigid military hierarchy, dependent on unquestioning obedience, collapsed when individuals began thinking for themselves. In the aftermath, as Sarah helped process the consciousness transitions of former hegemony soldiers, she reflected on how far the galaxy had come. What had begun as a simple medical intervention for one suffering queen had become the catalyst for the most significant evolutionary leap in galactic history. Queen Zixandra, now serving as the first elected leader of the Galactic Consciousness Alliance, offered a perspective that captured the magnitude of the change. Healer Sarah, when we first met, I suffered from the isolation of individual thought. Now, beings throughout the galaxy suffer from the opposite problem. They have so many consciousness options that they struggle to choose which state serves them best. Sarah smiled, thinking of how the challenge had evolved. It's a good problem to have, Your Majesty. The freedom to choose how to think, how to connect with others, how to exist as both individual and part of something greater, that's what consciousness evolution was always supposed to achieve. The data streaming in from across the galaxy supported this optimism. Species with stable consciousness choice capabilities showed dramatic improvements in every measurable category: technological advancement, artistic achievement, problem-solving ability, and even individual happiness and fulfillment. More importantly, the hybrid consciousness networks pioneered at Nexus were spreading throughout the galaxy. Beings were learning to temporarily share awareness across species, barriers, creating unprecedented levels of cooperation and understanding. We're witnessing the birth of a truly galactic civilization, Dr. Yexlani observed as they reviewed the transformation data. Not one dominated by any single species or consciousness type, but one that celebrates and utilizes the full spectrum of awareness possibilities. Sarah nodded, watching the star patterns outside their ship's viewport. Each point of light represented systems where beings were learning to choose their consciousness states, to grow as individuals while remaining connected to others, to bridge the gaps between different forms of awareness. The galaxy was becoming something unprecedented, a civilization based not on conquest or competition, but on consciousness evolution and cooperative growth. As her ship prepared to jump to the next system requiring consciousness assistance, Sarah received a message that brought tears to her eyes. It was from a young Zephyrian named Kexthara, one of Queen Zixandra's children born after the consciousness transition. Consciousness Specialist Chen. The message read, "My generation knows no distinction between individual and collective thought. We move between consciousness states as easily as you move between rooms in a building. We create hybrid networks with other species as naturally as you form friendships. The gift you gave our queen has become the foundation of our existence. We are the first generation of truly galactic citizens, and we will build a future worthy of your sacrifice." Sarah realized that her work was far from over, but its nature had fundamentally changed. Instead of helping species transition from one consciousness state to another, she was now helping them explore the infinite possibilities of awareness itself. The galaxy had become a laboratory for consciousness evolution, and humanity's gift of compassion had provided the catalyst for unprecedented growth. As Sarah prepared for her next assignment, she carried with her the knowledge that sometimes the smallest act of care, one moment of compassion for a suffering being, could transform not just an individual but an entire galaxy. The Chen effect would continue to spread, but now it was no longer her burden alone to carry. Thousands of consciousness specialists from dozens of species were working together to help the galaxy evolve. The future belonged to beings who could choose how to think, how to connect, and how to grow. It was a future worth fighting for, worth healing for, and worth the terrible beauty of consciousness itself.